All right, welcome to part 4 in our series on Power Automate approvals. Just to be completely upfront, this is going to be pretty much a talky video, no actual hands-on, but still it's really good information to have to know as you're starting to configure your approvals. There are a couple links that I'll throw into the description, the video description, to some resources on understanding these topics a little bit more in more detail. So anyway, we're going to talk approval details, links, and attachments. So basically, what do you need? What other things do you need to configure when you're adding that approval action into your Power Automate flow? Let's just list out the relevant fields, the things we're going to be talking about here today. There's a details field, which is equivalent to the body of an email. If you are sending the notification through email, you're using the built-in approval email function. This is sort of the center part of that template that gets filled out. We'll go over that and we'll go over the details momentarily. There's a spot where you can link to an item and provide a description for that item. So basically the text, the item link is the URL, and the description is what text you want to appear on that as that link. There's a field for the requester. We'll talk about that. And then there are a couple options to enable notifications, enable reassignment, and then the good old attachment section. Now note that some of these, in particular the notifications, reassignment, actually from requester down, you need to show the advanced or open the advanced options in the when you're configuring that action to see those choices. All right, so the details, as I said, this is basically what's going to show up in the center part of that approval message that gets sent to approvers. You can include static text in there as well as dynamic content, so it's very easy to bring in. If you're collecting from the person who's starting the approval, you're collecting a message, you can plug that in. You can include dynamic content if the approval is working on a SharePoint list item or a document. You can include things like the document name, who authored it, any of the other properties that are part of that document, assuming you get those in a previous step in the flow. Now, generally speaking, when I'm building approvals, I try to include all of the information that the approver needs in that details field. So basically, if I'm sending someone a request, to do this, or to enable this, or to allow this, I want to give them all of the decision points, or all the information they need to make that choice right there in that email. That's kind of the point of this email-based approval process, is that you want to give them everything they need to make a decision and make it. So understanding that in some cases that's not going to be possible. If what they're approving is, if it's something like an application for a job or a promotion or something like that, where there's just too much information, because there's sort of a balancing point where you have to figure out what is an acceptable length for an email and what's too long. So if it's going to be too much to include in an email, instantly I'm sure there is a limit to that details field. I have never found the limit, or I've never hit the limit, and I've included probably 2,000 to 3,000 words worth of text in there in some approval scenarios. So it's got to be a pretty high limit if there is one. So if you can include all of the text or all of the information they need, at least include the key points, and then you can leverage that item link or the attachment option to basically connect them to that item that they're approving, or view that file that they're approving, either as a link or as an attachment. So just, if you can, put all the decision points into the details. If not, give them the highlights and link to the additional information. You can style the details field, but you need to use something called Markdown. Now, why it's not HTML, we could argue that all day long. I personally really wish that it were HTML because I know HTML. Markdown is really just a different markup language. So I'll include a link to the instruction or the basic information you need to know about working with Markdown. I'll say that for simple things like bold text, italics, bullet lists, even simple tables, it's easy enough to work with once you kind of get used to it. But one thing that's really important to understand about Markdown is that client support for it is not exactly consistent. And again, on that Markdown page that I'll include a link to, they talk about sort of which clients between, and when we're talking clients, I'm talking Outlook Web, Outlook Windows, Outlook Mac, Outlook Android, Outlook iOS, as well as the Teams approval app. So you'll find that there are certain types of formatting that are supported in some clients and not others. I will say that currently it's pretty good, but if you go back a year or two, it was very, very kind of hit or miss. Like things would look great in Outlook Web, but for Outlook for Windows and Outlook Mac, you would just still see all this weird coding, basically the formatting code, as opposed to seeing the text being styled the way you wanted to appear. So right now the big disparity is, in my experience anyway, is the Teams approval app, because it will handle things like bold, italics, etc., but it will not format tables. So if you're going to include any kind of table in that approval details, you might just kind of want to downplay the ability to complete those through Teams. But again, the link that I include is going to give you a lot more info on how to work with Markdown. The item link and description, as I mentioned, this is kind of, I see this as what you use when you can include all the relevant details. Or if the approval is for a document, then I typically will include the link to that document, because you don't want to include the document itself in the message. So it's either linking to the document or attaching the document. I just prefer linking because I don't necessarily love sending attachments to emails. There are other issues to deal with there, but you can include a link to a list, SharePoint list item, a document, etc. One thing you want to be aware of is, before you just decide to throw that link in there, is to make sure that whoever is going to get that link has access to it. So if you're linking to a document, is that document in a place where the approver has permission to read it? If not, you can, a step before, you can generate a sharing link for that document and include that sharing link. So you do want, and you can do that for documents as well as SharePoint list items. So basically, just think about, does the person getting this have access? Because the last thing you want is for the approver to get the email, click the link, and say, that's great, I can't approve it because I can't read it, I'm getting access denied. So just think that through as you're planning your flow and make sure that they're going to have access to it. If not, get them access to that particular thing. And as I said, you can create a sharing link, or if you want to give them a copy of the file, then you can also include it as an attachment, which we're going to talk about next, I think, or shortly. So basically, item link description, make sure they have access to it, throw it in there if necessary. All right, so the requester field. This is kind of important to understand, because when you, as let's say your name is Bob Jones, you go and you create an approval in a workflow process that is then triggered by somebody else submitting a form. Guess who is listed as the requester for that approval? Not the person who filled out the form, but you, because you're the person who created that action, or you're the person whose connection is being used to create that approval. Microsoft saw kind of the flaw in this very early on, because the kind of V1 of the approval connector did not have a requester field, and then they added it later. Basically, the requester field allows you to specify who is sending, who is asking for this thing. It can be set to any user in your environment or a shared mailbox. The caveat being that if you want the person who's on whose behalf this approval is being generated to be able to see it in the approvals section of the Power Automate website, it does need to be a user. There's no, basically you can assign that requester role to a shared mailbox, but there's no way for that shared mailbox. The shared mailbox doesn't have a Power Automate license, so there's no way for the people with access to that shared mailbox to see the approvals that are being sent on behalf of that or requested by that shared mailbox. It cannot be set to a group or team mailbox. So this is, to me, a big flaw and something I'm hoping that Microsoft addresses in the future, where you'll be able to basically say that this team is the requester for this. There aren't a lot of scenarios where that's really where that would be beneficial, but there are a few, and it would be great if that were an option. And again, kind of rolling back, the approval is going to show up in the requester's sent approvals and history. So if an approval goes out with you as the requester, or you leave the requester field blank and therefore it's coming from you, then you can go to the approval, the Power Automate website, click on action items and then approvals, and you'll see a list of all the approvals that in sent. You'll see the approvals that you've sent that haven't been addressed, and in history you'll see those that you have sent as well as received, and the history of them. All right, notification and reassignment. Basically, these are pretty self-explanatory. Well, kind of, in that the enable notifications is basically allowing you to disable the sending of the email. Now, if you're using, basically, I would say if you want to use email-based approvals, and that's what a lot of the clients that I work with want, they want people to be able to finish this from within that email message, then I have to leave that set to yes. Now, understanding that if they're also the approver also has the Teams approval app, then they're going to get the notification in Teams as well. And there's nothing to stop them from using Teams to complete it. But the intent is for them to use the email that they get. And that's why we're sending that email. Now, if you know for a fact that you don't want them to use that email, that you're going to send an adaptive card in Teams, or you're going to have some kind of a custom screen in a Power App where they're going to approve or reject things, where basically if you're building an interface for them to interact with that approval, then you can just set this to no, and that standard template email won't be sent. So again, there's no right or wrong with either of those. Just if you want it through email, leave it set as yes. Otherwise, set it to no. But make sure that you're notifying them somehow. Reassignment is basically giving the approval the ability to hand that off to another person. So a good use case for this is maybe there's a request that is going to one person. It's going to, say, the finance person in the department, but they receive it and say, well, they're asking for a larger reimbursement than I'm authorized. They can reassign it to another person, to their manager, or to basically someone higher up in the food chain who can then make that decision. But if it's good for those sort of rarity cases where that might be required but isn't always required. Incidentally, it's probably better in those scenarios to build the flow so that if basically you're asking for what amount they're asking to be reimbursed, and then you're, depending on how much they're asking for, you're directing it to the appropriate person. But this gives you kind of a more flexible way to handle those odd scenarios when they come up. One important thing to note is that the only place this shows up is in the Power Automate approvals page. So in the email, they just see approve and reject buttons. They don't see anything that says reassign. So the only way they know that they can reassign is to actually go to the Power Automate homepage, click on action items, click on approvals, click on the approval, and then they'll see that option as, below reject, as shown in the screenshot here. So just be aware of that limitation. And attachments, good old attachments. This is, for a long time we didn't have attachments in approvals, and then they introduced attachments, and it was and everyone thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Then they found out there was a 10 meg limit on attachments, and there was a lot of grumbling, and then they upped the limit to 50 megabytes, which is a decent amount of space for attachments. But bottom line is that attachments are useful if the thing that's being approved is a file or document. So in other words, if someone is submitting a policy and it needs approval, then and that policy is in a PDF document or a Word document or whatever other kind of file type, including that as an attachment is fantastic. Or if it's multiple files, maybe it's an application from someone and there's, a cover letter and a resume and something else. You can attach all 3 of those files or 4 of those files, understanding that there is still a total encoded size limit of 50 megabytes. So practical size limit, I would say try to keep that under about 35 megabytes, just because encoding does add some space or consume more space than the files would natively. So if you need to include attachments, absolutely do. If you need to include multiple attachments, you do need to do that as, to do it dynamically. I mean, manually, if you're building out an approval process and there are maybe some template documents that need to be included, you can include those manually. But more often than not, you're going to build and as with any other time you're sending multiple attachments to an email or to a SharePoint list item, you're going to use an array to list out, the file name and the file content, and then that's going to be consumed by the approval action to send that email and include those attachments. So yeah, I'll include some other info on attachments in a link in the description, but use them if it's relevant. But a lot of people kind of just say, we'll have a very generic basic approval message like, hey, approve this, and then they throw in a bunch of documents. You do want to make sure that in your details you kind of spell out to the person what those documents are. Just kind of makes sense. All right, so that's it for today. It was a pretty short video, but like I said, this is important background info to be aware of. Next up, we're going to talk about keeping track of your approvals by creating an audit trail in a SharePoint list. So that'll be fun. Tune in, should be rolling that out in the next couple of days. Thanks and have a great day.